These are your superpowers, positive character strengths. You have them, all of them, some more than others.
What we are best suited to do in our lives connects with who we are and our character strengths.
Standing up strong, activating your superpowers is how you can change the world.
And you're pioneering the future of humanity.
Let's start right now.
Welcome to the Upstander Ripple Effect. I'm Kara Driscoll, Director of Marketing and Events for the Nancy and David Wolfe Holocaust and Humanities Center. In this podcast, we dive into the 24 character strengths and explore how positive psychology can help us live as upstanders today. During my senior year at the University of Cincinnati, I took a class with Dr. Gail Fairhurst, and the subject matter has resonated with me throughout my career in journalism and our work here at the center. Today, we're focusing on the power of framing and communication and the strength of leadership, what it means, how we can develop it, and why it's essential in building a more compassionate and just society. Dr. Fairhurst, who has extensively studied leadership and communication, is here to share her experience. Before we kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of communication and leadership, for those listening who didn't take your class, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you began your career and how you really began researching and studying organizational communication and leadership?
Well, that's a really interesting question because I credit it to working myself through college as a secretary. And so I saw firsthand a lot of organizational dynamics and just organizational life in general presented a lot of complexity that I thought was really interesting. And I was an English major as an undergraduate, but I really kind of moved increasingly towards communication, which was and still is a relative new discipline compared to, say, psychology or sociology or political science, but the focus was heavily on how people exchange messages and how they act in relation to one another. And that's what I was observing firsthand as a secretary. So I saw lots of good and bad leadership dynamics as well. And I had the opportunity to gravitate in that direction during my studies.
That's incredible. And you've gone on to have such a remarkable career and just so many different books and publications and research that you've done and students that you've impacted. And so it's great to delve into some of these topics, even for, 30 minutes with you. So we talk about leadership as a character strength at the Holocaust and Humanities Center, meaning it's something that we all have the capacity for, and we can develop those skills if we're intentional with it. So in your book, The Power of Framing, you delve into how leaders can effectively use language to shape meaning and influence. So can you kind of explain the basics of framing and what that really means and how people can use it in everyday situations, whether they're in, a formal leadership position or maybe it's just something they're striving to?
Right. Well, I would say, first of all, that we all have the capacity to speak, right? So the problem that folks sometimes get confused with, and managers fall into this category, is that they equate talking with communicating. And those are not the same thing. Just because we are able to speak, and maybe we're a relatively articulate person, who has a very big repertoire, that doesn't mean that we are aware of the context shaping features of our language use. And so what framing is about is understanding that what we do when we communicate is not just transmit a message, which is what we probably learned in public speaking classes, but that we are essentially creating meaning with another person to essentially paint a picture of that context, right? So, we can go to a cliche like the glass half full or the glass half empty. That would be an example of, are you a very positive person and you always see that glass half full, and so you point to those positive aspects of what the context is providing, or do you think the sky is falling and you're constantly talking about the negatives? That would be a great example of that. In the leadership context, though, I would just add that it's not just the leader who creates meaning. And that's what I think is different about a communication approach, as opposed to, let's say, a psychological approach that looks for, what are those cognitive abilities that leaders have. A communication approach is going to look at how we together negotiate meaning about whatever is the task before us, whatever our identities are, or what our relationship is like together.
Interesting. And I can think of a million different ways that we would use that in daily situations. On a larger scale, we've seen a stark contrast of leadership styles nationally and internationally in recent years. We're just coming off of an election. How has the current political and civic landscape changed the way that you think about organizational leadership and leadership communication as a researcher and as a scholar?
A very complex question, but an excellent one. I would say that the current political landscape has influenced me for about the past 8 years, because we're in an era that many scholars would call a post-truth leadership era, in that we have in Donald Trump an individual who has a facility with language, but he tends to tell more fabrications, more lies, if you will, than the average political candidate or average elected official. I mean, we always assume something on the part of politicians, but if you look at fact checkers in various news media organizations, you'll see that he has gone well beyond that. Okay. He's not alone, though. In the business community, we've had Enron, and we've had the 2008 banking crisis. So Trump certainly didn't invent that. But what's important about this notion of post-truth leadership is that communication doesn't matter all that much, right? And it's only what actions you take are important. And boy, oh boy, as a person who teaches undergraduates and feels that desire to want to help them become leaders, if I tell them that their communication doesn't matter, it goes against everything that I know about how trust is built in relationships, in organizational cultures, in society. So I think the idea that communication doesn't matter is one of those things that communication professionals like myself really has to help students understand, that you might see this going on at a national level, but for you personally, this is not a style that I would encourage you to embrace. And I think that certainly in the case of Enron or the banking crisis, individuals probably didn't start out with that particular way of deceiving individuals, but I think people get to it incrementally based on the organization's culture. Nevertheless, it's not a good starting point for educating our leaders of tomorrow.
No, and you talk about this post-truth era. I'm curious, in the conversations that you're having in the field, is anyone talking about how having this type of communication style and this type of leadership style, where truth might not be of importance, is that trickling down in different situations, or is there any research or conversations happening in the field about how that's impacting communication on all levels?
I think we've always had a certain amount of it in society. for example, individuals who are very verbally skilled, right, have that choice to make as to whether they're going to use those verbal skills to manipulate the situation or not. I'm thinking Bill Clinton, for example, during the Monica Lewinsky debacle, right? And in his testimony, he was quoted as saying, "Well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is, right?" And of course, he was lambasted for that, because that was someone who was very skilled in a vocabulary, but yet looked like he was trying to manipulate the situation a little bit. So we've always had some of that, okay? But what I would say is different about now is that one can be contradictory. One can say one thing, the sky is blue, the sky is black, whatever that is. And there seems to be now an indifference to contradiction. And so I think it goes to the heart of, what are your values? What is your integrity? What kind of culture are you trying to inculcate into your organization? Because I think that level of indifference to contradiction is what's new. And I hope it's not trickling down, but I suspect it is. Yeah.
Sure. And to that point, we're certainly seeing, I think, plenty of, if not more, over the past 8 to 10 years, more what you would call wicked problems versus tame problems, everywhere across society, not only in our country but across the world. Can you explain what that term means and how leaders and everyday upstanders can kind of work together to come up with solutions for a wicked problem?
Yeah. A wicked problem is is a problem that has many tentacles. You can think of it that way. It keeps morphing. It doesn't. You aren't able to solve it. No one individual can solve it. It requires collective leadership, collaborative leadership. It requires that leaders have the kind of collaboration skills and perspective taking skills to understand that this is a sort of always kind of a moving kind of entity in terms of tackling that problem. So a wicked problem is just particularly tough. With my students, I make a distinction between a wicked problem, such as, for example, our healthcare system, or problems in the Middle East, or the climate change. And problems that are very complex, but potentially solvable. And I think that one of the things that I try to get my students to try to understand is that there is a difference between the two. And if you are a good collaborative leader, and you bring the right amount of resources to that collaborative team or set of teams that you have to create, then those are potentially solvable. And I have seen upstanders work in that context.
Yeah, can you give me an example of what a good example of how people have come together to solve one of these complex issues?
Yeah, several years ago when we had Fernald, do you remember? As a Cincinnatian, you might remember it was a site that was producing uranium products for the Cold War effort. And so we saw generations of workers contributing to this Cold War effort. Well, there was a lot of environmental contamination. The government decided to shut the site down. And we saw Floor Daniel, which was a construction company, come in and get the contract. But it was an unusual site because the Department of Energy had its own operation right there side by side. And so as a construction firm, the building goes up or the building goes down, you're out the next day, right? Well, Floor started to do some downsizings that were quite problematic. The first one, you imagine yourself a worker, and your grandparents had worked at this place. You show up for work one day and you are invited into your manager's office, and he or she tells you, you have a half a day to conclude your business at the other end of campus. Here's a box for all your stuff. People were just blindsided by that. And this human resources manager, who it was quite a character, was a former high school principal. He's a hog farmer in his off hours. He watched this and was really surprised by the reactions. I mean, there was just a tremendous amount of emotion, not only on the part of the people who got downsized, but also the legacy workers that were left and having to watch their coworkers. So the government ended up throwing money. And the money that was used, therefore, was quite an attractive package. And what this human resources manager did was he paired with a Department of Energy official who was on site, and the two of them essentially crossed their cultures and cultural boundaries to try to talk to employees and find a way to soften the nature of the downsizing. Well, the resources for that downsizing were so great that so many people volunteered to be downsized that they had to say no to a whole bunch of them. So together, this human resources guy, this middle manager, this former high school principal, he had his ear to the ground about what might work. And he and this Department of Energy official came up with a plan that they called managed attrition. And essentially, employees would learn 2 years in advance that their job was about to be downsized. But in that 2 years, they could use government resources for training, for getting a degree, going back to school, and it was one of those plans that had been formulated based on keeping your ear to the ground, talking to a lot of people on the government side, talking to a lot of people on the Fleur Daniel side, talking to a lot of people at the plant, and the Department of Energy loved it. People in the HR department at Fleur loved it. The employees loved it, and it worked for several months. But Fleur Daniel ultimately didn't love it, and so they they couldn't get rid of him because the Department of Energy really thought so much about this individual. But they downsized all 8 people that reported to him. So here was a guy who was at middle management, who was trying to fight for downsized employees, legacy workers who just, needed some help in this downsizing process because they were so overwrought. And he thought he came up with a plan that would help both the company as well as employees. Ultimately, he was sacrificed for that, but he was an upstander. He was one of those individuals who, for a time at least, worked well with the system and tried to do what was right.
We talk all the time about how it's not easy to be an upstander. It can sound kind of lofty and, do the right thing. And if you say it in a vague way, sure, it sounds like a nice thing to do. But often you, as an upstander, you are the one who's sacrificed, or you are the one who, faces the ramifications of doing what's right or what's hard in the moment. So that's a great example. And it's interesting to think about the concept of being an upstander with this framework and how you can use framing and communication and collaboration to do that kind of upstanding work. I'm curious, that was a great example, but in your own life or in the experiences that you've studied, how have you seen people activate the power of framing and leadership to better themselves and others? That was a great example, but curious if you have any others in recent moments.
Actually, it's interesting. I was thinking of one of the former department chairs of my unit, who is now since retired, but she had a previous spouse who caused her essentially to go to Al-Anon on a regular basis to help support him. But she was a very big believer in Al-Anon and its principles about equality and its principles about fairness and the greater good. And I saw her for 8 years essentially use Al-Anon principles related to equality and related to the greater good. And that framing in particular came in time after time after time, because faculties can be quite petty. I didn't know if you knew that, faculty members. I mean, they're human. But that notion of the greater good was a frame that just resonated time after time after time. And you could really see how this became a foundation that allowed her to reflect, as have a mental frame, if you will, a cognitive frame related to the greater good, but then to pose that in a collective setting and to say, what is the greater good, and to arrive at a consensus about what that might mean, given the situation. So that would be, I think, a great, an everyday example that I got to see close up for 8 years. And I was always struck by the simplicity of that kind of orientation, but yet the power of it.
Sure. It's such a great reminder that, something as simple as communication, something that we don't, cognitively think about what we're saying all the time, is a way to be an upstander, right? Being thoughtful about the way that we speak and use our words. And it's a great example of that. I want to ask you one more question. If you could give people 3 things to think about to become better leaders, whether they're in a formal role or not, what would they be? Kind of the basic starters.
I guess the first thing would be to know yourself and your values, right? And to make sure that you have a good value foundation, because I think that's so critical to integrity. And making sure that if you have that facility with language, that's used properly, right? The second thing I would say is reflexivity. And by reflexivity, I mean taking the time weekly or daily, if you have that capacity, but at least weekly, to reflect on how your communication went over the week. Not so much to kick yourself that, oh, I wish I'd said this, or, oh, I wish I'd said that. But to think about how you might do something differently if you wanted to change it. And let that be an opportunity to essentially prime your unconscious brain for your next communication. And then the third thing I would say would be to develop a heightened sensitivity to language. And by that, I mean, regardless of where you see it, if it's you're reading a novel, or if it's a blog, if you see something in a Netflix drama, whatever it is, just take that moment to reflect on what was it that hooked you. I mean, if you look at the best speakers in history, the best leaders in history, who we regard as individuals who were particularly articulate. People always think, oh, they were born that way. But actually, they were all wordsmithers, right? A Ronald Reagan, or a Barack Obama, a Martin Luther King. We could go on, but those individuals were wordsmithers. By that, I mean that they understood the power of language. They played with it a bit. They understood what particular phrasings could mean and what might be the consequences of that. When I do executive coaching, right, most of my job is helping leaders understand the consequences of their communication and understanding that language that they may be using that they're really, quite unconscious about has particular kinds of effects.
Those are incredible 3 tips that hopefully we can all think about in the next week or so. Dr. Fairhurst, I just want to thank you for being with me today. And I'm sure we could talk for hours about all of this, and I need to reread The Power of Framing and soak it in again.
Thank you. That would be lovely.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kara. I appreciate being invited today.
Our thanks to the Mayerson Family Foundation and the VIA Institute on Character for supporting this series. We have a link in the show notes so you can take your own free character strengths survey and learn more about your strengths. We'd love to hear about your experiences with character strengths and how you're using them to stand up. You can reach us anytime by email, and you can listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit holocaustandhumanity.org/podcast. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at Cincy HHC. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. Technical director is Josh Emerson. Opening sequence is by Ken Furman. Select music is by Kik Lee. And this is recorded at Technical Consulting Partner Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.